During the First World War, the United Kingdom possessed the largest navy in the world, ranging from the battleships and battlecruisers of the Grand Fleet to smaller units like that of the destroyers and submarines of the Harwich Force, or, of course, the Monitor forces bombarding coasts ranging from the English Channel to Gallipoli in the Mediterranean Sea. However, they had several tragic losses of ships in the war, the most famous of which were the three battlecruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary, and Invincible at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Still, there were other ships lost during the war due to enemy action, internal explosions, or other reasons. In today's video, we'll go over some of these losses and the reasons behind them. First up, we have the dreadnought battleship HMS Audacious, a super-dreadnought battleship displacing around 23,000 tons and was armed with 10 13.5-inch guns, making her one of the most powerful dreadnoughts within the Grand Fleet at the start of the Great War. Because the fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow was not ready to host so many vessels, as the small base did not have the proper facilities to care for the men, supply them, or their ships. It also didn't help Scapa Flow was not connected to the mainland by rail, meaning that supplies had to be brought by ship. Because of the recent destruction of the Bacanti-class cruisers on the Broad 14s due to a submarine in September 1914, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet Admiral John Jellicoe got the approval of the Admiralty to transfer 2 battle squadrons to 2 new harbors, Loch Nakiel on the Isle of Mull on the Scottish west coast, and Loch Swilly on the north of Ireland. Both harbors had narrow and easily defensible entrances, as well as shallow bottoms, making entrances for submarines difficult. However, the real threat to Audacious and the other ships of the 2nd Battle Squadron was that of mines, not torpedoes. In October, the fast 17,000-ton North German Lloyd liner Berlin, which had been armed as a merchant cruiser and was also equipped with a large number of mines, passed through the North Sea into the Atlantic with orders to mine the approaches to Glasgow on the River Clyde. Instead, the captain of the Berlin chose to mine the area off Tory Island, northwest of Loch Swilly, choosing it because it was the main trade route from Liverpool to America. On the night of the 22nd of October 1914, Berlin laid 200 mines across the entrance to the channel used by most of the shipping in and out of Liverpool. Following this, she sailed north to attack shipping to Archangel, but was forced to seek shelter in Norway and thus interred by the Norwegian government. But on the 26th, Berlin's minefield claimed its first victim when the merchantman Manchester Commerce struck a mine and sank. For several days, this loss did not reach the Admiralty or Jellicoe aboard Iron Duke in Loch Swilly. On October 27th, Jellicoe ordered Vice Admiral Sir George Warrender, the commander of the 2nd Battle Squadron, to take it out for gunnery practice. These were some of the newest and most powerful dreadnoughts in the Grand Fleet, and they were going to carry out firing practice near Tory Island off the coast of Donegal, with the battle fleet consisting of the firing line, Centurion, the flagship, Ajax, and Audacious, while the target line consisted of Orion, Monarch, and Thunderer. On the morning of the 28th, the 2nd Battle Squadron with Audacious third in line maneuvered, and as she was turning onto the gunnery range, with the official time for the signal given to make this turn at 8:40, approximately at 8:45, a dull explosion could be felt in the ship. An officer on the bridge believed that she'd accidentally fired one of her 13.5-inch guns, but with no sign of smoke, there were some thoughts that Audacious had been hit by a torpedo, and with the ship almost being torpedoed in August, along with recent sinkings of elderly cruisers in September, it was a logical conclusion. At 9 a.m., the order had been given to close all doors and hatches, and the ship's company was at action stations. At about that same time, the ship took on a slight list to port, and it was then realized that the ship might be mortally stricken. All bulkheads and doors in the vicinity of the explosion were checked to see whether they needed shoring up, and to determine whether the starboard wing compartments could be flooded to compensate for the weight of water in the port side and get the ship back on an even keel. Around the same time of the explosion, reports from the engine room explain, there had been a small splash of water in the area some 16 feet above the main deck level. Furthermore, eyewitnesses stated that the condenser in the port wing engine room lifted slightly and then dropped again when the explosion occurred. As a direct result of the explosion, the following compartments were flooded: port wing engine room, port aft hydraulic engine room, dynamo room. The following areas filled with seepage: ex-shell room, watertight compartments near port wing engine room, bunkers on starboard side, central engine room, junior officers' bathrooms, X-turret cooler spaces, after medical distribution spaces, bathroom flat, main deck abaft X 13.5-inch turret, middle deck in the area. With the plausible threat of a submarine in the area following Admiralty orders issued after the sinking of the aforementioned Bacanti armored cruisers, Vice Admiral Warrender took the rest of the 2nd Battle Squadron away to avoid any further attacks if there was a submarine in the area. There was one confirmed thing. Audacious was taking on water, and lots of it. Audacious was brought out of line away from Ajax and Centurion and was put into the wind to keep her steady. She was now heeling over approximately 10 to 15 degrees and did not appear to be righting herself. Because of this, Captain Cecil Dampier of Audacious believed that she was sinking fast and that she should be abandoned. But as the light cruiser Liverpool, escorting the larger ships, was circling the sinking Audacious, she began to settle more slowly. Finding that she could still make 9 knots, Dampier decided that he was going to try to make it to Loch Swilly to try to beach her there. While trying to right the ship, the crew struggled to close many of the valves, and water could not be prevented from entering the central engine room. By 10 a.m., the water was 5 feet deep, but there was no evidence of the longitudinal bulkheads having cracked. Upon inspection, it was found that the explosion had taken place approximately 5 to 10 feet forward of the after engine room bulkhead. The port engine rooms were out of action, so it was up to the starboard engine rooms as water continually crept into those compartments, and a little before 11 a.m., the starboard compartments had to be abandoned, leaving Audacious dead in the water. While this was going on, Jellicoe, who had been previously notified, was gathering every destroyer, tug, and trawler at Loch Swilly and Loch Nakiel to help Audacious and to try to prevent the presumed U-boat from making a further attack. But until there was evidence that there was not a U-boat in the area, Jellicoe would not send another battleship to attempt a tow of the floundering dreadnought, with the pre-dreadnought Exmouth being put on short notice to go to perform the tug. Vice Admiral Sir Lewis Bailey, who was in command of the other battle squadron in Loch Swilly, offered to go to Audacious by destroyer to take control of the situation, which Jellicoe agreed to. Back on Audacious by 11 a.m., all steam power had been lost, which made it difficult to ready the boats as the crew had been doing. All non-essential crew were taken off the ship, but because Captain Dampier believed that the ship could still be saved, he and a work party of 250 men stayed aboard the ship. With the light cruiser Liverpool and several other destroyers in the area who received the distress call of Audacious, it was decided to take her into tow. At 1:30 p.m., the 45,000-ton White Star liner Olympic arrived on the scene, with her captain, H.J. Haddock, volunteering to help by taking her in tow, being ignorant of the threat of submarines or the underwater mines. With destroyers taking hawsers from Audacious to the liner, Olympic made little headway with the battleship in tow. With the heavy seas and the weight of the sinking dreadnought, it was clear that it was an impossible task, with the hawsers repeatedly snapping. Liverpool tried as well, but it would go equally as poor, and a final attempt by the collier Thornhill had just as much success. Jellicoe that afternoon received the report of the sinking of the Manchester Commerce by a mine and that of another merchant vessel that had struck a mine the previous night. At 5 p.m., Jellicoe was certain that Audacious had not been torpedoed and instead had been struck by a mine. He then ordered Exmouth to try to tow the sinking dreadnought. On the scene at 5, it was getting dark. The quarterdeck was completely awash, and a lot of water was getting below deck, so much so that she was becoming unsteady. Shortly after 5 p.m., all hands except 50 men were ordered off. Both Admiral Bailey and Captain Dampier would stay on. By 6:15, the ship was in a bad state, and it was decided to abandon her. Bailey and Dampier were taken to Liverpool along with the rest of the men. So by the time Exmouth arrived on the scene, it was too late, and Liverpool was ordered to stand by through the night, which made sense as by 6:50 the angle of the list was 30 degrees, but still she showed no signs of turning over. 2 hours passed before her stability vanished. With Robert K. Massey in Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the winning of the Great War at Sea describes her end as, but at 9 p.m., after a 12-hour struggle, Audacious suddenly capsized, and a few seconds later, blew up. Ironically, the explosion in the empty vessel was responsible for the only casualty in the sinking of the battleship. A piece of debris, flying 800 yards, landed on the deck of Liverpool, where it killed a watching petty officer. From British battleships of World War I by R.A. Burt, Audacious lay upside down until approximately 9, when there was a terrific explosion and flames and debris shot to a height of at least 300 feet. 2 lesser explosions in the air were reported, and these were thought to have been 4-inch shells exploding. It would seem that either A or B magazine had exploded, the theory being that the high explosive shells had been displaced by the ship's list and had detonated on hitting the floor. This would have ignited the cordite and produced the spectacular explosion in the large sheet of flame. It was recorded that the magazines contained 1,120 13.5-inch and 2,400 4-inch shells with their charges. Eyewitnesses claimed that the ship's bow was at an angle of at least 45 degrees during the explosion. Almost immediately afterwards, Audacious disappeared beneath the waves. Her loss was officially kept a secret, with Jellicoe fearing that his advantage in dreadnoughts was so slim that if word got out to the Germans, they might come out at an inopportune time. The ship's crew was quietly reassigned to other ships, with Audacious still being on all the list of ships and fleet maneuvers. Jellicoe, dismayed by the loss of a dreadnought, was desperately anxious that the sinking be kept a secret. That night, when Olympic reached Loch Swilly, the Admiral prohibited any communication between ship and shore. Then he signaled the Admiralty, urging that the news be suppressed. The Grand Fleet's margin in numbers over the High Seas Fleet was so slight, Jellicoe reckoned that he now had 17 serviceable dreadnoughts to Ingenohl's 15. That knowledge of this loss might bring the Germans out at the wrong time. Jellicoe realized that, owing to the presence of Olympic, the loss probably could not be concealed for long, but any time he could gain would help. Churchill and his colleagues agreed, but because concealment of naval losses was so contrary to British and Royal Navy tradition, the Admiralty could not issue the order on its own. The decision went up to the Cabinet, where they approved, fearing that it might encourage the Ottoman Empire to join the war on the side of the Germans, which ultimately they would regardless of the sinking of Audacious. The sinking was finally announced on the 13th of November, 1918, 2 days after the armistice. Out of the 41 dreadnought battleships that fought in the Great War for the Royal Navy, Audacious was the only one lost to enemy action. I'll close this section out with one last quote from R.A. Burt. The cause was never officially confirmed, but it was thought that she had struck a floating mine displaced by Centurion or Ajax, which was steaming ahead of her. The possibility that she had been torpedoed was never ruled out. The inquiry into the loss of a practically new battleship found that the strength of the longitudinal bulkheads was inadequate to stop water from reaching the central part of the ship, the major factor contributing to her loss. Bulkheads buckled, doors could not be closed, and valves stuck, all of which made it extremely difficult to prevent the ship from filling rapidly. Next up is the battleship HMS Vanguard. Vanguard was at anchor in Scapa Flow in the afternoon of July the 9th, 1917, as the ship's company was practicing abandoned ship procedures. These drills were intended to make sure that the crew was prepared in case of an emergency, as large Royal Navy vessels had gone down in the war. And a little over a year ago by this point, several battlecruisers at Jutland had exploded due to German gunnery and the mishandling of cordite. Granted, in those cases, events happened quicker than the crews could react, but probably more prudent to the drills at hand was the sinking of HMS Audacious. Within several hours after completion of these drills, Vanguard would resemble the likes of Indefatigable, Queen Mary, or Invincible. While the crew was conducting these drills and finishing up at around 5 p.m., the ship dropped anchor near the north shore of Scapa Flow, coming to a complete stop at roughly 6:30 p.m. The ship had most of her boilers running during this time and continued to run for a time. Even though it was wartime, a lot of doors were open that were meant to be closed. The thought was that the ship was in home waters, inside the most patrolled and protected port the Royal Navy had. The order to close these doors for the night was given at 8:30, and all seemed well on the ship. Nighttime routines were beginning, with some of Vanguard's officers leaving the ship, attending a concert on the theater ship Gorku, anchored beside the Royal Oak. One of them was Midshipman R.F. Nichols, who in October of 1939 was second in command on the same Royal Oak, again escaping death in dramatic circumstances. While away from the ship, one can assume Nichols at around 11:30 that night heard a tremendous explosion which turned out to be the ship he served on. To take from R.A. Burt's British Battleships of World War I, from the many varying accounts given by witnesses aboard nearby ships, it would seem that smoke was seen to issue forth from the area just below the foremast. After a short interval, a heavy explosion was accompanied by an enormous sheet of flame, after which the ship became enveloped in dense smoke. A second explosion followed the first and greatly increased the flame area, but the precise location of this eruption was never determined because of the dense smoke. Some eyewitnesses claimed the third explosion, but this was considered to have been rumblings within the moving hull. One witness said that he had noticed some alteration in Vanguard's trim, but as he was the only one to claim positively that he had seen the ship explode, his evidence was received with a certain amount of skepticism. No one witnessed the sinking of the ship. The general consensus of the witnesses was that the explosions had occurred within the vicinity of P and Q 12-inch turrets, probably in the magazines, of which we'll get into a bit later. A large amount of debris was thrown up into the air, and when it came down, it landed on HMS Bellerophon and the other surrounding battleships. In the sources that I have looked at, there seems to be a disparity of how many men were on board at the time of the explosion. Some put closer to 800 and others 850, so it's safe to say that at least 800 men were on board. Of those men, 3 survived the explosion. However, one would succumb to his wounds and the other 2 recovered. Following the explosions and a disaster of this scale, a board of inquiry was set up to try to find out what happened to the ship. Now, this board came up with 3 possibilities, one or more of which could occur. The first being negligence on the part of the officers in charge of cordite stowage. The second, ashes from boilers being placed up against adjacent bulkheads of either P or Q magazines. Or 3, enemy action, either by U-boat or saboteur placing slow-fused bombs aboard. Before we continue into the board's findings, I'd like to spend some time looking at the possibilities they suggested. In regards to the first, negligence when it comes to cordite stowage, even before the war, this problem was noted as an emphasis was put on gunnery speed, with a faster rate of fire being preferred over careful calculation. This obsession with speed led to unsafe practices like stacking ammunition outside protective magazines and leaving anti-flash doors open during drills or battle. Previously, Royal Navy ships had similar incidences like the cruiser Natal, which caught fire and sank quickly in Cromarty Firth, or the pre-dreadnought Bulwark, which went down in a similar incident. Of course, more famous incidences of mishandling cordite silk bags happened at Jutland with the battlecruisers under the command of Admiral David Beatty. It should be noted that Beatty was part of the Speed School, although not everyone in the Royal Navy was. Jellicoe had taken steps to try to curb unsafe ammunition handling in the battleships, but that was easier said than done, as individual captains of ships tended to follow their own rules in this regard. A prime example of this is HMS Agincourt, who fired 144 total rounds of her 12-inch guns. Even in Beatty's flagship at the time of Jutland Line, steps were being taken to curb the excessive amounts of powder stored outside the magazine by Warrant Officer Alexander Grant, who came from the Grand Fleet, and was not popular due to his actions of actually storing cordite properly, along with other safety procedures. Because of it, it probably saved Beatty at Jutland when Line suffered the hit that caused the destruction of Q turret. After the losses of Indefatigable, Queen Mary, Invincible, and damage to other ships including Lion, committees were set up to investigate what happened to the ships, and it was determined that the ships were sunk by heavy shells. But with the stacking of cordite, each turret became its own magazine, and it was clear that the practice should not continue as it was putting the ships at great risk if they were hit. Even though it was recommended that the practice should not continue, with Beatty taking command of the Grand Fleet in December 1916 and the independence of the captains and officers of the various dreadnoughts of the Grand Fleet, it can be seen how unsafe practices could be allowed to continue on ships like Vanguard. In that same vein, there is a possibility the cordite on Vanguard was older, and as cordite ages, it becomes less stable. The next possibility of ashes from the boilers being placed against the bulkheads could cause powder in P and Q magazines to ignite is plausible, as we will soon see with the committee's findings and later on in the video. As for enemy action either by U-boat or saboteur, it is possible that a U-boat could have entered Scapa Flow and sunk Vanguard, as attempts were made to enter the anchorage in the First World War, and of course the sinking of Royal Oak at anchorage in Scapa Flow in October of 1939 by U-47. As for a saboteur, this is just my 2 cents. It is possible that agents of both sides were operating in each other's countries throughout the war, and there are reports of spies in the Second World War in and around Scapa. Those claims are disputed though. But it just seems unlikely that a saboteur could get on board a battleship given the remoteness of Scapa Flow and an explosive device going unnoticed. Also, why go for an older dreadnought like Vanguard? She certainly was not as powerful as some of the newer ones like the Iron Dukes, Queen Elizabeths, or Royal Sovereigns. The committee began inspecting the debris first and found the debris on Bellerophon and the other ships came from the central part of Vanguard and not near A magazine as some had thought. If, as was thought, one of the magazines had exploded, the gases would have a large venting area through the uptakes in the vicinity so that the plating in the passageways would not have been subjected to great heat, but would have received extreme blast effects. Next, the board asked the surrounding ships to furnish figures showing magazine temperatures at dusk the day of the disaster. The startling fact was that there was no statutory system for logging temperatures. Sometimes the job was left to the chief stoker and his group, and those were only random checks. There were no abnormal temperatures of those ships that had logged temperatures. As I mentioned, there were attempts to have safety procedures in place for the magazines, but standard procedures across the Grand Fleet had not been put in place. In the preliminary findings, coal had been stored in the fuel spaces adjoining P and Q handling rooms, and when the hatches were closed, little to no ventilation. One of the bulkheads formed a wall of the 4-inch magazines. They state the temperature rose beyond the normal, and cordite ignited spontaneously. It was noted there had been a fire aboard Vanguard in one of her coal bunkers in 1914, and the cause had not been ascertained. Evidence shows that Vanguard's 4-inch gun deck had been completely closed in by protective mattresses shortly before her loss, and this would have prevented the circulation of air to the magazines and shell spaces. Another critical finding was that the funnel uptakes and ventilation trunking were hardly ever inspected and could frequently become clogged, thus adding more credence to the possibility of the 4-inch magazines having started the explosion. The board found that the loss of the vessel was caused by a fire started in the 4-inch magazine, which quickly spread to either Q or P magazines, setting off the cordite charges therein and destroying the ship. There are other explanations that the Board of Inquiry goes into, as they cannot say for certain what caused the destruction of the ship, only what is most likely, and no blame was attached to the over 800 men aboard at the time of her explosion. The wreck of Vanguard is still in Scapa Flow, as it is considered a war grave, and people dive to explore the wreck. I will try to remember to leave a link to a website to look at the pictures of the wreck in the description. Our final ship on our list is a little different as it's a former Norwegian coastal defense ship, HMS Glatton. In 1912, the newly independent Norwegian government envisaged a large naval expansion to protect its coastal waters, having a rather long coast filled with fjords and inlets, which included further vessels to add to their existing fleet of 4 coastal defense ships, along with destroyers and submarines. In January 1913, the plan for the coastal defense battleships was entrusted to the British firm Armstrong Whitworth, which had built 2 vessels for them before, and these 2 were to be delivered to the Norwegian Navy in 2 years. The dimensions of the hull were restricted to the only dry dock the Norwegians had access to at the Horten Naval Dockyard near Oslo. This meant that the ships were rather small, only displacing 4,807 tons as designed, and were armed with 2 240mm or 9.45-inch 50 caliber guns in single turrets. Also mounted in single turrets were 4 150mm or 5.9-inch 50 caliber guns, 6 100mm 3.9-inch guns, and 2 submerged torpedo tubes completed the powerful armament of these small coastal defense battleships. The ships were also well protected, having a 7-inch belt and a 2-inch protective deck that ran the length of the hull. The machinery was modest and provided for a 15-knot top speed. With such a small ship, it was tough to fit all the machinery and magazines into these ships. In Operations 1919 to 1945 by Ian Buxton has this to say: The only place for the midship 150mm magazine was sandwiched between the engine and boiler rooms, an arrangement used in British battleships, although in conjunction with insulating airspaces. Keep this in mind, as it will be important later on. The two ships were named after two major Norwegian cities, Bergen and Trondheim in Old Norse. Both ships were launched in the summer of 1914, with Glatton launched on August 8th, shortly after the Great War had broken out. In November 1914, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill and First Sea Lord of the Admiralty Jackie Fisher appreciated the fact that these two vessels, with their capabilities as coastal defense battleships, could be appropriated for coastal bombardment, something on the mind of these two men with the bombardment of the Dardanelles going on in the future Gallipoli campaign and the opportunities on the French and Belgian coasts, not to mention the creation of the 14-inch monitors and 12-inch monitors. So, arrangements with the Norwegian government were made for Norway to transfer the two ships to Britain and for Britain to refund the installments already paid, totaling some £740,000 for the two ships. On January 9, 1915, orders went to Armstrong to complete the two ships for the Royal Navy at the earliest possible date. Changes needed to be made to meet the standards of the Royal Navy. The guns were rebored to 9.2 inches and 6 inches respectively, enabling existing service ammunition to be used. 12 double-bottom tanks were modified to carry oil fuel to increase endurance, and the boilers were converted to coal/oil firing. In early spring 1915, the ships were renamed Gorgon and Glatton respectively. This work was estimated to take 10 to 12 months, although the work was suspended by the Admiralty to allow faster progress to be made on Admiral Fisher's pet project, the large light cruisers, namely Furious and Courageous. In September 1917, orders were sent to Armstrong to complete the ships to newly revised designs. Anti-torpedo bulges were to be fitted, covering 75% of the hull length, which will be important later on, and this necessitating the removal of the torpedo tubes, along with further changes to the guns, a tripod mast abaft the funnel, and of course, an increased displacement with all this new weight and a reduced top speed. The result of all these changes was the fact that these coastal defense battleships were now monitors, each with two very powerful 9.2-inch guns and a secondary battery that was nothing to sneeze at. These two ships could be a useful reinforcement to the monitor force that was operating off the Belgian coast, attacking German positions. The modifications did, of course, take time to complete, and it was not until August 31st, 1918, was Glatton commissioned at Newcastle under Commander Nestor Diggle, a friend of Admiral Roger Keyes of the Dover Patrol. Gorgon had been commissioned in May and had arrived at the Dover Patrol on June 6, 1918, where she spent the next few weeks working up and then began working with the 12-inch and 15-inch monitors to attack German positions near the coast. Meanwhile, Glatton arrived at Dover on September 11, 1918, where she and her crew of a little under 350 men started preparing for the big offensive plan for later that month. Glatton was in the harbor at Dover on the night of September the 16th, when the two friends, Keyes and Diggle, were taking a walk after tea, where I think monitors of the Royal Navy, How the Fleet Brought the Great Guns to Bear by Jim Crossley describes the scene best. Admiral Roger Keyes, commanding the Dover Patrol, had been glad when his friend Commander Nestor Diggle arrived at Dover with his new ship Glatton, in time to join the bombardment of the Belgian coast. The Admiral invited his friend for tea with his family, and they were walking the cliffs together when a terrific explosion shook Dover, and a black mushroom cloud erupted from somewhere near the harbor. The two men rushed back to the Admiral's house, where they were informed by telephone that Glatton had experienced a magazine explosion in one of her magazines and was on fire. Jumping into the Admiral's wife's old Ford, they were driven at breakneck speed to the harbor to find an operation already in hand to evacuate many burned people from Glatton and tugs alongside pumping water into the fire. If the explosion and fire weren't bad enough, the ammunition ship Granshaw lay in the next berth 150 yards away, where it had enough ammunition aboard to devastate all of Dover. As they arrived, they could see huge yellow flames from Glatton's midship 6-inch magazine that continued to shoot up through the roof of Q turret, starboard midships, and reach the masthead among the clouds of white smoke. The smoke turned to black as the fire reached the oil and coal bunkers surrounding the magazine and boiler rooms, and then began to spread aft. Diggle's officer corps had been devastated by the explosion and fire, where he found only one surviving officer aboard, a junior surgeon who was busy tending to the men, but a petty officer who was on shore leave came aboard and joined Captain Diggle. Diggle and Keyes had clambered aboard Glatton's forecastle to find the casualties had been heavy in the mess deck areas and officers' quarters directly above the seat of the fire. The after part of the ship was completely cut off by the flames, so they could not organize effective rescue operations in that area. The petty officer and Diggle went on a desperate search for the seacocks and the flooding keys for the magazines. They managed to flood the forward part of the ship, but the after part could not be reached through the still raging fire, and it was only a question of time before the aft magazine blew up, probably taking Granshaw and most of Dover with it. The terrible situation was made worse, as there was many men below crying out for help, and seamen from nearby ships swarmed aboard to try to save them. After about 45 terrible minutes, the cries from below ceased as Admiral Roger Keyes ordered the ship abandoned, as he was going to sink her one way or another to prevent the destruction of Dover. Keyes reluctantly decided that his only course of action was to sink Glatton by torpedo. So boarding the nearest destroyer, Cossack, not that one, which had just arrived from Hull. Cossack's first 18-inch torpedo hit the bulge amidships, but embedded itself in the plating without exploding, as it had not traveled enough distance to run off its safety device. At 7:40, Cossack's second and last torpedo was more successful, punching a hole in Glatton's starboard side, but the 200-pound explosive was not enough to defeat the torpedo bulge that was installed, and Glatton remained afloat, still burning furiously. Keyes then transferred to the destroyer Mings and ordered her captain to torpedo Glatton. Two 21-inch torpedoes were fired from close range into the existing hole in Glatton's side, and at 8:15, under a barrage of torpedoes, she heeled over slowly to starboard until she came to rest at 148 degrees over the vertical, with her masts and superstructure resting on the bottom and part of her port bulge showing above the water. The fire was quickly extinguished, and the danger of further and far more dangerous explosions was averted, thanks to the heroic efforts of the men of the destroyers, tugs, Glatton, and those on shore. They ensured that Dover remained intact and not a crater. Casualties for Glatton were heavy, involving over half the crew of 346. One officer and 59 men were missing, and a further 124 were injured, with 19 unfortunate souls dying from their burns. With the recent loss of HMS Vanguard and Scapa Flow due to a possible cordite explosion, and the losses of the battlecruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary, and Invincible at Jutland 2 years ago, a court of inquiry was set up immediately to determine the cause of the explosion. It was established that the fire had started in the 6-inch magazine amidships. In the plans for the ships that I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, this was sited in the hole between the boiler rooms and engine rooms and flanked by the 6-inch shell rooms. Like in my video on the loss of Vanguard, there were several theories for the cause of the explosions, with sabotage, spontaneous ignition of the cordite, mal-operation of the oil fuel and coal bunkers, and overheating of the magazines were all examined. These all are very interesting ideas, where Buxton explains things better than I could. There was no reason why that last one should have occurred, as not only had insulation been provided all around the magazine, but special cooling equipment was installed. Sabotage was often suspected during wartime, but it was soon ruled out, particularly as the ship had not been in contact with the shore since leaving Newcastle a week earlier. Spontaneous ignition of the cordite was also unlikely, as tests on other charges from the same batch showed that it had not deteriorated significantly in storage. The stokers were in the habit of piling red-hot ashes and clinker from the boilers against the magazine bulkhead before periodically clearing them up the ash ejector into the starboard after corner of the boiler room. The stoker petty officer thought that the engine room was on the other side of the bulkhead and that there was no danger in the practice. This was promising for the investigators, as it could be a possible explanation for the cause of the explosion. So, going to Glatton's sister ship Gorgon, they closely conducted an experiment to see if this was the cause of the explosion. They examined Gorgon at Dover. Issues with the 6-inch ammunition and insulation of the midship 6-inch magazine were noted. The bulkhead construction, including cork and wood paneling, showed that blistering of red lead paint reached temperatures of at least 400 degrees Celsius. Trials were conducted by deliberately piling red-hot ashes against the bulkhead, but results were inconclusive, with temperatures not high enough to ignite the cork or wood. The possibility of oil seeping into the lagging was considered. Tests showed that cork could release flammable gases in the presence of high temperatures and air under pressure. Despite various trials, no conclusive evidence emerged by 1919. Eventually, in the April of 1919, the Court of Inquiry gave its verdict concluding that the slow combustion of the cork lagging of the 6-inch magazine of the Glatton led to the ignition of the magazine and then to the ignition of the cordite in it and so caused the explosion. When shown the findings, both Engineer-in-Chief Vice Admiral Godwin and the Director of Naval Construction Eustace Tennyson Danecourt did not accept that the cork had burnt. Nevertheless, insulation on Gorgon was replaced by silicate cotton to be on the safe side, and as this was going on, a more likely cause was revealed. Behind some of the wood paneling was not granulated cork, but empty spaces in folded newspaper, causing further investigations of the bulkhead, which showed the existence of half-inch diameter holes in the plating where rivets had been omitted. These two discoveries pointed to a very likely cause of the fire, although no conclusions had been drawn. The ashes could have raised the temperature sufficiently to have ignited the newspaper, which may have been present in Glatton also, with air supplied through the forced draft pressure in the boiler room through the open rivet holes, and the cork under these conditions would have given off flammable gases, charred the wood paneling, and eventually ignited the cordite charges. This is speculation, as the true cause will never be known, since the ship was destroyed. Salvage work proved difficult, as Glatton was lying at an awkward angle. Work would not begin until May 1925, and through the use of tugs and cranes, Glatton was refloated and moved alongside the western pier of the submarine harbor in March of 1926, where her hulk is now buried under land reclaimed for the present car ferry terminal. The true cause of the fire and subsequent explosion will likely never be known, although in my research, I can't help but think about all the issues with cordite the Royal Navy had during the First World War, and the Russian Navy for that matter, with my recent video on the Empress Maria, and especially the loss of Vanguard, because they seem very similar. Anyway, let me know what you all think, and until next time, my friends, have a great week. Thanks for watching once again.